Good morning, everyone. Well, as you probably know by now, I have contracted COVID, and so I'm here at home. I tested positive a couple of days ago. The symptoms aren't that bad. I mean, I had coughing that lasted for a little while, and congestion and headache that seems to persist. I guess it was a parting gift to me from the Garden Island of Hawaii. So my message is going to be remote once again, although it does feel a little bit different because I know that some of you are going to be watching it live at SASF together. So welcome. I hope that you are all healthy and well. My message this morning is going to continue on with our series on the Enneagram, which is a personality typing system that identifies that there are 9 basic personality types, and we each have a core personality that matches with one of the 9 types. As I've discussed in the past, the Enneagram is also broken into 3 triads, and there are 3 personality types included in each triad. Types 2, 3, and 4 are in the heart triad, and their underlying battle is with shame, in the sense that they are not acceptable. Types 5, 6, and 7 are in the head triad, and their underlying battle is with fear, in the sense that they are not safe and lack security. Types 8, 9, and 1 are in the body or gut triad, and their underlying battle is with anger, in the sense that they are not good enough. These 3 primary emotions, anger, fear, and shame, and the defense mechanisms that we develop to manage and overcome them will often form the primary barriers that will keep us from having genuine relationships and experiencing the kind of life that God created us for. I saw one article that summarized the emergence of these 3 motivating emotions in the aftermath of the fall in the Garden of Eden, and how each of them became a part of our broken humanity from that point forward. I'm not going to read through the entire event in Genesis. I'd guess that many of you are familiar with the general storyline. After Adam and Eve ate from the tree that they were commanded not to eat from, we see the presence and impact of these 3 basic motivating emotions already at work in Adam and Eve. In Genesis 3:7, we witness the underlying emotion of shame entering into the human experience. And the defense strategy from that point forward was, I cover, when Adam and Eve then made fig leaves to cover their bodies. Then in Genesis 3, verses 8 to 10, we see the emergence of the underlying emotion of fear, with the accompanying defense strategy of I hide, which is what both Adam and Eve did from God. Then in verses 8 to 10 of chapter 3, we see the emerging motion of anger, and the defense strategy from that point forward becomes I blame, which is what Adam did to Eve. I think this is helpful in shedding light on how each of the different personality types respond to their underlying core emotion. Of course, this isn't true in all instances, but I do think it is generally true for each of the 3 or each of the different personality types. This is often how we deal with our unresolved underlying emotions in unhealthy ways. And I just wanted to share that brief thought as kind of an overview of what we've been studying, but also as an introduction to the personality type that we are looking at today, which is personality type 6. Now, I want to begin today by showing you an Enneagram iceberg of the type 6 personality, which illustrates what others will typically see of a type 6 on the outside, representing the visible part of the iceberg, versus what's going on underneath the iceberg, representing what they actually feel inside. For an Enneagram type 6, what others typically see are that they are trustworthy, inquisitive, loyal, pessimistic, and skeptical. While on the inside, what type 6s actually feel are that they are unsafe, afraid of making the wrong choice. They have a fear of the unknown, and they are anxious and unsure what or who they can trust. Now, as most of you know, I have been using the characters from the movie Encanto as kind of case studies of the different Enneagram personality types. So given these brief descriptors from the type 6 Enneagram iceberg, Who in the Familia Madrigal do you think is a type 6? Sixes are known as people who tend to see danger around every corner. They are the person who is constantly scanning their environment for potential pitfalls and perils. If you know someone like that, someone who seems overly cautious and unsure of others and even themselves, then you likely know an Enneagram 6. And although Enneagram type 6s get a reputation of being a chicken little, or someone who panics or gets alarmed easily, they're actually called the loyalists. They are the ones who will stick with you to the very end. Many of those who study the Enneagram say that 6s are often the glue that holds the rest of us together. And when they're healthy, they're amazing. So who in the family Madrigal is the loyalist that's going to be the topic of our conversation for today? Well, brace yourselves, because today we're going to have to talk about Bruno. In Mirabel's opening song, she only briefly mentions him by saying, "My Tio Bruno." They say he saw the future. One day he disappeared. Later on in the movie, we learn a little bit more about Bruno, like he knows when it's going to rain, or who might be in danger of hurting themselves, and even has a premonition that the family's magic is going to fade. Bruno seems to be able to foresee every bad thing that's going to happen, and it doesn't exactly make him the life of the party. For instance, on his sister Peppa's wedding day, there wasn't a cloud in the sky before Bruno warned that it was going to rain. And once he put that thought into Peppa's head, because Peppa's emotions can control the weather, she then couldn't control herself. And so they ended up getting married in a hurricane, and she never really forgave him for that. When Bruno had a vision of the family's magic fading, he left. Except he didn't really leave, as we find out later. He hid inside of the walls of the casita. And he spent years patching cracks in the wall, caring for the family, even during his exile. When Mirabel finds Bruno, he says to her, "My gift wasn't helping my family, but I love my family." That's why 6s are the loyalists. No matter how the family treated Bruno, no matter how he felt, he remained loyal to the family. And he is now the one helping to hold the family together, even though they don't really know it. But Bruno isn't the healthiest of type 6s. He knocks on every piece of wood he sees, throws salt and sugar over his shoulder, and he tends to gravitate to thoughts that the worst possible future is going to come to pass. 6s can't actually see the future like Bruno can, but they're convinced that if they try hard enough, they might just be able to. And this fear leads them to worry and to dwell upon and to plan for worst case scenarios, because they believe that by doing so, they can keep themselves and the people that they love safe. This driving force for type 6s comes from the deepest motivations within them. For type 6s, their basic desire is to feel secure. And they produce that by creating safe, predictable environments and by creating strong, stable relationships in which they trust that others will support them. On the flip side, their greatest fear is to lose their security and their support and the stability of their environment and life. In 1999, a book was released called The Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook that provided humorous but real-life instructions for what to do in unusually dire circumstances. The book advertised itself as the essential companion for a perilous age, and it talked about things that were both frightening and yet sometimes funny at the same time. It offered 50 chapters on things like how to perform a tracheotomy, or how to land a plane, or how to survive skydiving if your parachute doesn't open, or how to deal with a charging bull or escape from a swarm of killer bees. When the book first came out, many people kind of shrugged their shoulders and thought that, okay, well, maybe a few people might buy it as a gag gift. Well, the book wound up selling over 10 million copies, and prompted a series of other subsequent books and games and calendars and even 2 television series. And to whom should these authors thank for their epic book sales and the comfortable life that I would assume that they are now living? Well, I would say that they could start by thanking the Enneagram 6s in our society, who probably accounted for a majority of those sales. You see, 6s tend to experience and see the world as a dangerous place where disaster could strike at any moment. Appearances to them are deceiving, and people could have hidden agendas. They keep their eyes peeled out for possible threats, and they mentally rehearse what they will do in the event that the worst happens. For 6s, imagining and planning for these unfortunate scenarios is one way in which they maintain a sense of safety and control in an unpredictable world. 6s are often referred to as the loyalist because they are known as the most faithful and dependable people on the Enneagram. Of all the personality types, 6s are the most loyal to their loved ones and to their friends. They will go down with the ship and hang on to relationships of all kinds far longer than any other personality type. In addition, 6s are also loyal to ideas, systems, and beliefs that they have established trust in. The relationships that they have formed and the beliefs that they hold on to is ultimately driven by their desire to find a sense of security and support in the world. The struggle that 6s often face is that they don't believe that in and of themselves that they can provide the security that they long for, and so they will look for it in other people or through a belief system or ideology to help them to find that security they long for. That is, again, what they are driven by. Now, on the positive side, 6s are the best at accurately assessing risks and threats in any given situation. They have an innate talent for intuiting potential problems and risks, and they're likely the best problem solvers of all the Enneagram types. But like all the other Enneagram types, the underlying motivations that produce our strengths could also become our Achilles heel and the source of our greatest struggles. The deadly sin of the Enneagram Type 6 is fear. Although when we say that fear is the sin which the 6 gravitates to, what 6s actually experience is anxiety. Fear is what arises when you're in the presence of a clear and immediate source of danger. You know, like when a guy wearing a hockey goalie's mask kicks in your front door and starts chasing you around your house with a chainsaw. Anxiety, by contrast, is a vague, free-floating sense of apprehension that arises in response to an unknown or potential threat that may never actually materialize. It's what you feel when you imagine what would happen if a guy wearing a hockey goalie's mask kicked down your front door and started chasing you around your home with a chainsaw. Fear says something wrong is actually happening, and this is necessary at times for our survival. Anxiety, on the other hand, is more anticipatory and says, what if this happened? Or what if that happened? What if? What if? This is the experience that 6s often have. And they can even experience this anxiety when life is going smoothly because they'll begin to wonder and assume that something is going to come along and ruin it. What's interesting about Type 6s is that those who study the Enneagram say that 6s can have 2 very different responses to the fears that they harbor, and that these 2 reactions are so different outwardly that they can appear to come from 2 different Enneagram types. They refer to these 6s as phobic 6s and counterphobic 6s. When phobic 6s sense danger, they tend to lie low. They may act cautious, compliant, or ambivalent in order to avoid danger. When counterphobic 6s sense danger, they often deliberately provoke it by acting outspoken and being aggressive, wanting to handle trouble before it handles them. And in this way, they can resemble a Type 8 in the way in which they can sometimes take control. In the movie Encanto, Bruno's character illustrates this tendency in sixes. When Mirabel discovers that Bruno has been hiding within the walls of the casita and notices that there are cracks in the wall that have been repaired and asks him about that, assuming that he must have been the one fixing the cracks and keeping the house together, Bruno responds by saying, "Oh, that? No. I'm too scared to go near those things. All the patching is done by Hernando." Who is Hernando? It's Bruno with his hood up. I mean, it's kind of a silly gag, and Bruno admits as much, but it captures the duality with which sixes can sometimes live their lives. Phobic sixes are afraid to go near the cracks. They want to stay as far away from danger as possible. These sixes usually find some kind of authority figure that they can trust, and then they stick with that person through thick and thin. For Bruno, that person is abuela. Counterphobic sixes are Hernando. They confront, challenge, and oppose, and they can seem tough and challenging and forceful. In the Bible, Peter, the Apostle Peter, was probably a very good example of a type 6. On the one hand, he demonstrated counterphobic tendencies in his willingness to get out of the boat and step onto the water with Jesus, as well as the time when he drew his sword and cut off the ear of one of the individuals who had come to arrest Jesus. But then in other moments, fear would get the best of him, and he would react more from the phobic side of his personality, most notably when he denied even knowing Jesus when the tide of public opinion had turned against Jesus and his movement. But despite how different phobic and counterphobic sixes might look, they share the same root, a desire to avoid a frightening world. Those who study the Enneagram and other psychologists say that sixes as children likely learned early on that the world isn't safe, and for whatever reason they felt that the adults that were in charge couldn't be trusted. Now, a number of things could have contributed to this. They could have been abused or neglected or treated unfairly, or maybe the love that they received might have been inconsistent. But sixes who grow up with an innate sense that the world is not safe and who feel vulnerable respond by either obeying or rebelling. But in both cases, they are responding from a place of fear. The defense mechanism that type 6s struggle with, and that is their blind spot, is projection, whereby they have a tendency to project their own thoughts onto other people, with the result that they intuit hostility or negative reactions from those around them, even though there really is very scant evidence of that. The result is that sixes will often view the world through a lens in which they perceive the world to be much more dangerous and threatening than it might actually be. And the times in which we now live makes this even more difficult for sixes. The air that we breathe is filled with anxiety. Regrettably, you and I are not the first to figure out that 8 billion of our Earth's inhabitants are easily motivated by fear and a deep need for security and certainty. Politicians, cable network, marketing experts, dare I say even preachers, know this as well. I mean, there is a plethora of places that you can go to that will feed that fear and target people like sixes who are prone to anxiety. And it's into these times that I think Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount can speak powerfully to us, and especially to those of us who are sixes. And we have to remember when reading the Sermon on the Mount to whom Jesus is speaking these words. He's speaking them to a mass of people who are poor, oppressed, and trampled upon. People who have every reason that you do, and more, to worry and fear. And his words are aimed not at pacifying them or comforting them. His words are actually aimed at liberating them. Jesus says to them in the 6th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, "So don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today's trouble is enough for today." Don't worry about tomorrow, Jesus says. Well, that seems somewhat easy for him to say. But you'll notice that Jesus doesn't say, hey, there's nothing to worry about. He says tomorrow is tomorrow, and it will be here soon enough. Let's focus on today. You see, most of the time, our anxieties are anchored in our future. In fact, I would say that's probably true more than 90% of the time. But what often gets lost when reading this passage are the words that Jesus spoke prior to uttering them. And I'm going to read them to you, but I'm going to read them to you from the Message translation because I believe this translation captures more of the essence of what Jesus is wanting to communicate. And I'm actually going to go back a ways as well to what he said because I think we need to hear it in the bigger context in order to understand the kind of picture that Jesus is painting. Here's what Jesus said, starting with verse 19. Don't hoard treasure down here where it gets eaten by moths and corroded by rust, or worse, stolen by burglars. Stockpile treasure in heaven where it's safe from moth and rust and burglars. It's obvious, isn't it? The place where your treasure is the place you will most want to be and end up being. Your eyes are windows into your body. If you open your eyes wide in wonder and belief, your body fills up with light. If you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a musty cellar. If you pull the blinds on your windows, what a dark life you will have. You can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both. If you decide for God, living a life of God worship, it follows that you don't fuss about what's on the table at meal times or whether the clothes in your closet are in fashion. There is far more to life than the food you put in your stomach, more to your outer appearance than the clothes you hang on your body. Look at the birds, free and unfettered, not tied down to a job description, careless in the care of God, and you count far more to him than birds. Has anyone, by fussing in front of the mirror, ever gotten taller by so much as an inch? All this time and money wasted on fashion, do you think it makes that much difference? Instead of looking at the fashions, walk out into the fields and look at the wildflowers. They never primp or shop, but have you ever seen color and design quite like it? The 10 best dressed men and women in the country look shabby alongside them. If God gives such attention to the appearance of wildflowers, most of which are never even seen, don't you think he'll attend to you, take pride in you, do his best for you? What I'm trying to do here is to get you to relax, to not be so preoccupied with getting so that you can respond to God's giving. People who don't know God and the way he works fuss over these things, but you know both God and how he works. Steep your life in God reality, God initiative, God provisions. Don't worry about missing out. You'll find all your everyday human concerns will be met. I think those are words that can really speak deeply to us in these times in which we live, but especially to the type 6s in our midst. And Jesus isn't condemning those who are fearful and worrying for their future. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus isn't judging or even trying to placate the fears of his people. He's wanting to liberate them and bring them into a new reality. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I study, I believe this was actually the bigger picture of most of Jesus' teachings. The whole Sermon on the Mount is like an act of imagining. Jesus is inviting us to imagine our world as a place where God's presence becomes more a part of our reality. A place where instead of greed and just trying to take all that you can, and which will then just sow seeds of competition and distrust and winners and losers, is replaced by contentment and generosity and kindness. Jesus is saying, if we learn to live into that reality, if we become that kind of people in the world, so much of what we tend to worry about will be taken care of. and God will take care of the rest. But I know this is a stretch for many of us who live in this culture that we live in, especially to those of us who are sixes, because trust is a really big issue for sixes. And when it comes to the matter of faith, it really does boil down to a question of, do you trust that you are secure in God's hands? Can you choose to live in the ways that Jesus described and stop believing that it's your responsibility to patch all of the cracks in the casita? Last week, the hard truth for fives when it comes to the matter of faith was that you're never going to have full certainty. I mean, that doesn't exist. For this week, the hard truth for sixes when it comes to the matter of faith is that you will never have in this life that deep sense of security that you chase after in this world. There's no amount of money you can make or safety nets that you can buy or plans that you can put into place that's going to calm all of your worry. You can't do it. And in that way, security, whether it's financial or otherwise, will become like an idol in our lives. And it makes promises that it can never keep. This is why Jesus tells us from this big picture that he is painting through all of the different strokes of his teachings, don't chase after all of those things. Don't do it. Instead, trust in God. This is the pathway towards healing and growth for many people, but especially for type sixes. Let's pray together. Father, I am thankful so much for the type sixes in our midst, because they really are the glue that hold us together. They are the guardians. They are the ones who watch over us, oftentimes patching holes or cracks in the casita when we're not even aware of it. But sometimes that fear gets the best of them, and they begin to project out and begin to worry about the future. And this is where their struggle can truly become not just something between themselves and people, but between themselves and faith and life, Lord. And so I pray that you would help them, Lord, that your Spirit would allow them to sense your presence, Lord, and that they can learn to trust that they are in your hands and they are secure and they are safe. We're thankful, Lord, for our time. It's good to continue looking through the Enneagram and using Encanto as kind of an illustration of the different personality types. Help us, Lord, to continue to grow, not just in our faith, but also in our character, Lord, as we learn to become more like Christ in our lives. Again, thank you for our time, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Please take care, be safe, and I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.